Welcome, and thanks for watching this webinar. I'm Sue Shermer from Heartland Area Education Agency, where I support the work of school counselors.
And I'm Meredith Doman with Des Moines Public Schools and serve as the Student Supports Coordinator, so I coordinate the counseling program.
And we're here to talk today about the evaluation supplement for school counselors that was created over this past year. And to give you just a little bit of history, both Meredith and I are on the Iowa School Counseling Association State Board. And one meeting, we had conversations about the connections between the Iowa teaching standards and school counselors, because it seems like many administrators and counselors struggle in that evaluation process for how are they going to be evaluated. And there are many documents floating out there that are crosswalks of artifacts that you can use to demonstrate those standards, but nowhere does it really say, well, this is what the standard looks like for teachers, and this is what it looks like for school counselors. And so at that ISCA board meeting, it was decided that ISCA would support the work of a committee of folks from across the state to do that work. And Meredith and I were fortunate enough to lead that group. And so we started out at the very beginning thinking about, in a perfect world, what would that look like? And we didn't want it to be just another checkoff, but rather something that would be used as a reflection tool for school counselors, and also an advocacy tool and an education tool for school administrators.
And so from there, our work began to work with a committee of counselors from across the state who all volunteered to support this work. And we started working, Sue and I first, and looking at the 8 Iowa teaching standards and then comparing them to a very lengthy document of school counselor competencies. Those school counselor competencies cover about 5 key areas, but then have 204 detailed competencies within those 5 areas, compared to the Iowa teaching standards of the 8 and 43. So looking at that, we first started with breaking down what are those key areas, and we discovered that a lot of the detail in those 204 competencies was about what a counseling program looks like or what counselors do day in and day out. It wasn't necessarily the higher level competency that they need to be able to demonstrate in order to show that they are being an effective counselor and implementing an effective comprehensive counseling program. So from there, we took that and began the work of an alignment. It's not necessarily a direct crosswalk, but aligning those key areas to make sure they were all covered at a high level, and then distributed that out amongst the team to see what had missed, what they found that was different, and separated those out, compiled all of that work back, and had the framework. Then from there, we took what to do with all the rest that wasn't covered, because we didn't want to just ignore some of those other competencies. So we'll walk you through here later this actual supplement, but we then took that doing piece and created a rubric. So there's an alignment of the standards, but then there's also more detail to cover all the rest of those nitty-gritty competencies along the way.
And those competencies, as we said, did come from the school counselor competencies from ASCA, but going on the work of Charlotte Danielson and her framework for teacher evaluation, and how this really gives some insight into how might I move from effective to highly effective, or move from maybe not quite meeting the standard into meeting the standard. That's what we wanted to do. And again, as Meredith said, we'll go through each one of those at a more in-depth level later.
And so after we had all of that feedback from counselors across the state, Sue and I then worked together to compile, and we tried to stay true to all original published documents as best as we could. This came from the American School Counselor Association competencies, language in that ASCA national model, language from our Iowa framework, which is tied to the Department of Education site visits and what is looked for in terms of having a comprehensive counseling program in place. So we did have to make some grammatical changes to make sure the document flowed and had similar language and structure. But beyond that, wanted to keep it true to the original forms and have as minimal interpretation of those of us on the team working as possible. So then from there, we submitted it out to vet it through several administrative channels, looked at school practicing principals and administrators across the state who took some time to dig into this and give us some feedback and look at some of the language used and help ask for some clarifying questions. Went through school administrators of Iowa as well. And very, very grateful for the amount of feedback that we've received along the way with this document.
And so now it's ready, it's in print. We anticipate that there may be revisions coming forward as our world changes As we know in education, it often does. But this is our purpose, and we're hopeful that you find it helpful for you, again, not only in looking at your work, but for administrators as they are looking at what should they be expecting from a school counselor. There is one caveat. Please be aware that you can't be required to use this, because that would impact some teacher union decisions or education union decisions, but that this is a document that's highly suggested, and that's why it's an evaluation supplement. It's not required, but it is certainly one for you to use for your professional growth and movement.
And so with that in mind, we think it's a very reflective tool for counselors, and hopefully will help other stakeholders in the school and across the state understand the unique role and skill set of school counselors.
Thank you. So let's dig into the document. You'll notice it says 2014 at the top. We're anticipating that we may be making refinements and updates, so make sure that you do have the most current issue. The second page has some general information as well as a quote from Dr. Buck, and he has been extremely supportive and complimentary of this work. The summary level of performance sheet that you see on page 3 is a great tool to use as the counselor prepares their yearly professional growth plan. This is an opportunity for them to look at where they are in each one of the standards as well as where they want to be and move forward from there. This is kind of a summary document. We are thinking that this document can be used very easily by both the counselor and the administrator in their pre-conference and post-conference discussions when they are on cycle as well. So let's dig into the 8 standards.
With Standard 1, Focus of Student Achievement, as you'll see, the black sentence at the top is as it's stated in the Iowa Teaching Standards, and the red paragraph below is the interpretation and connection of the Iowa Teaching Standard to the American School Counselor Association competencies. Those have been created all basically using language from the Ask a National model, and as well as other supporting documents that tie in with that, and then interpreted, very little interpretation actually, just looking at how to explain the connection there. So you'll see in this one, as we look at student achievement, that counselors often, in addition to their work directly with students, can impact student achievement through leadership, advocacy, collaboration, and working towards systemic change as part of their entire system. So down below, you'll see the criteria A through G on the left, which shows the language from the Iowa Teaching Standards, and then the high-level aligned school counselor competencies. There are about 204 school counselor competencies and criteria along the way. So this is the higher-level overview of them. And then as you move on to the next page, we'll see where some of the detail of those criteria are in the rubric. The rubric is also language of those 203 criteria along the way that shows in there. You can see the effective and highly effective. We did decide to separate those out, even though they both would be considered meeting the standard. As you look through everything on effective, that is what every counselor should have the opportunity to do. But we understand there may be barriers that are in or outside of the counselor and administrator control that could prevent a counselor from being highly effective. So it is an opportunity to look at those barriers, see what can be removed, because that would add to the comprehensive counseling program and therefore results for students. Also then down below, you'll see that, or on the side, developing or needs improvement, and ineffective, being both does not meet the standard. Now what's on developing could also be included in the effective and highly effective, as that is the continuum of growth along that way. It doesn't exclude things that are in developing. Those can often be done in addition to the effective and highly effective criterion. The ineffective, however, is in there because we need to acknowledge that there are things that can happen in our schools that are potentially detrimental to students and ineffective to implementing a comprehensive counseling program designed to impact student achievement.
So moving on to Standard 2, which is considered the content knowledge standard. Again, you'll notice the language from Iowa Teaching Standards, but if you think about how content knowledge relates to the school counselor work, it's really focused on those 3 domains of counseling, those academic, career, and personal social development. I'd also like to mention that much of the research that's used in personal social development comes from the same research that's used for social emotional learning. So while you may use social emotional learning or personal social development, those are both very similar. So as you glance at this, you'll see the ways that we expect counselors, and again, this comes from ASCA and from the school counselor competencies, to provide that content knowledge in academic, career, and personal social development. This page is intentionally left blank because the next 2 pages can be then viewed side by side. So you've got the national or state framework up at the top, and then the domains, career, planning, academic achievement, and personal social development, as well as those other components of a school counseling program, which are individual student planning and responsive services. All of these, again, should be used in a comprehensive school counseling program.
And then looking at Standard 3, and Standard 3 and Standard 4 are pretty closely tied together here. So you'll see again the comment from the Iowa Teaching Standards about competence in planning and preparing for instruction. And then as we look at how that happens in a comprehensive counseling program, it's also in a variety of environments and a variety of different methods. So this takes all of that into consideration, and because classroom-based instruction is only one aspect of that program, we have included the criteria of planning specifically for that instruction in Standard 4, and then looking at Standard 3 for that instruction. So the planning is included here in Standard 3. When you're planning for the instruction and making sure your instruction is effective, you'll see in Standard 4. So again, we have the aligned school counselor competencies, that there is a core curriculum that is aligned with student needs and student standards, and that there are action plans implemented along those lines. And you'll see those as we move into the rubric. The details of those action plans might not just be curriculum. So that while the curriculum is aligned, there are also action plans that are created to help close gaps in achievement or attendance or behavior, as well as developmental needs through small groups and other aspects of the counseling program.
So as Meredith said, Standard 3 is closely aligned with Standard 4 for the work of the school counselor. But as you look at diverse learners, oftentimes we think that that's in instruction in multiple learning. But also this, for a school counselor, means that they are using that multi-tiered system of support to reach every student. And so it's not just our special needs students, but it is the diversity of the student population, so that there's equity and access to that comprehensive program, so that every student in the building has access to the professional school counselor. And you will see all of these listed here, and there's quite a few. But as we move over into the rubric, those fell out into 3 specific areas: that of equitable programming, the culturally responsive collaboration, which you'll notice that's not just instruction, but it's also collaboration in how that counselor works with other individuals, all of those stakeholder groups, and then finally advocacy and promoting awareness of the fact that there are different students with different needs, and we want to improve those educational outcomes for students.
And then as we look at Standard 5 with assessment and using a variety of methods to monitor student learning according to the ITS, we're also looking at, in addition to the assessments that counselors use for their curriculum lessons or small group or individual planning and goal setting, that counselors also are involved with the use of data and collaborating and consulting with teachers on a broader scale as well. Counselors should be utilizing both their process data, which explains what they're doing and who they're serving with their interventions, and as well as perception data, which is the attitude, skills, or knowledge that students have gained as a result of those interventions, and also the outcome. Again, we're always looking to support our student development and student growth, particularly in their attendance, behavior, and achievement areas. So again, the aligned Iowa Teaching Standards on the left, and then in the box on the right, looking at those pieces of collaboration. Digging in a little bit deeper here, on the rubric is looking at how counselors understand and use data, again, not just within their own program, but in working with others, and programs and interventions that they're measuring what they're doing and using that to guide the needs, as well as whether or not any intervention or lesson or group activity was effective. And then also how they're overall evaluating their program, not just, again, their day-to-day instruction and work with kids, but having the time to take a step back and look at the overall program assessment.
Because counselors do impact the classroom and they come into a classroom, you'll see that this is very similar for that one piece. However, as Iowa administrative rules states, you must have a school counseling program, an articulated sequential K-12 program that's comprehensive in scope, preventative in design, developmental in nature, driven by data, and integral to the school district's curricula and instructional program. So unlike a teacher, a school counselor is involved and responsible for running that entire program. So we have taken the standard of classroom management and expanded that to not only classroom management, but also program management. The underlying question is, how are students different as a result of the school counseling program? It isn't about what the counselor has done, but it's about the impact on students. So you'll see these school counselor competencies that are aligned. And then if you look over again into the rubric, you'll see program management and some of those very specific items there. Of course, many of those are connected to the other standards as well. But then because they do have classroom management issues, we've included classroom management down at the bottom for those that portion of time that a school counselor is delivering classroom instruction.
And then moving on to Standard 7 with professional growth. This highlights the content area specific professional development that is important for counselors to participate in and have access to. So we've listed in the professional organizations and the aligned school counselor competencies on the right, there's some opportunities for counselor involvement in all of those, as well as looking at their professional development plan, again, creating their goals that are aligned with implementing a counseling program that is directly tied to improving student outcomes in their schools. As we look at then the rubric for that, you'll see again the professional agencies, again some suggestions there for membership and opportunities to collaborate depending on the size of the district or the buildings in which they serve. We know that counselors across the state have various connections for teams, so we want to make sure to show some opportunities there. And then plan for professional growth, again, connecting to their content area and the importance, again, of having those professional development opportunities be content specific for counselors so that they can improve their craft as well. And then, again, participating in the appraisal process.
And finally, for the last standard, this is very similar to that of the teacher as you evaluate teachers. However, the difference comes in, as you can imagine, there's a whole series of ethical standards for a school counselor because their work is a little bit different than that of a teacher, and they have some different requirements in terms of confidentiality. So what we have done here is applied the ethical standards and principles of the school counseling profession. There's a whole document provided by ASCA on ethical standards for school counselors. And those take those ethical standards that we sign as we get our license from the Board of Educational Examiners in Iowa, and it really ramps those up to a much more specific nature. If you look at the rubric, this rubric looks a little bit different because in those ethical standards and confidentiality, those two areas, really, how do you differentiate in terms of effective or highly effective? We just said for ethical standards and confidentiality, either you're meeting or you're not meeting. There is no middle ground there. And so those are laid out pretty clearly right there. And then finally, on the bottom row, you'll see the district, local, state, and federal policies. And that's when the specific nature of what's required at different levels is listed. So those are the 8 teaching standards aligned with the school counselor competencies from the American School Counselor Association.
And if you go on to the back few pages here with Appendix A, this is a document that is currently used for school site visits from the DE. So if you are up for a site visit, you will need to show comprehensive counseling program in place in your school or district. And this document, the words highlighted here in black are from the current document that is being used for that. And then in red, there are some suggested artifacts that also, again, tie in with a comprehensive counseling program to consider including in there. So that is listed just as a resource as it connects with the professional growth and development of counselors, as well as their program implementation. And there's the second page on for that as well.
And finally, the back page is just a thank you to those who gave up their time to work on this document. We had several revisions and reviews, as you can imagine. All of those listed are the committee members from the Iowa School Counselor Association, but we don't want to leave out the input that we got from School Administrators of Iowa and from many administrators and guidance folks that were around the state giving us input and suggestions for improvement. Thank you. Again, if you have any questions, any feedback, or any suggestions, please contact Sue Shermer at Heartland Area Education Agency or Meredith Doman at Des Moines Schools.